like me.
Really?
You guys ready?
Yeah.
You guys ready?
As soon as he gets back, I
He's
guess.
gonna fill up.
Yeah, he's gotta have another drink.
Well, welcome tonight. Thank you for coming out to the Montana Historical Society. I hope you're picking me up. You guys can all hear me all right? Okay. My name is Jeff Malcolmson. I'm from Photograph Archives here at the Montana Historical Society. And I'm going to introduce folks that are participating tonight. This is our year-long excursion into Montana history, focused on the year of statehood, 1889. And this is our second time kind of getting together. We should have a couple more events like this. We're going to see how creative we can get for our next event, which will probably be in the summer months, I suppose. We may even go outdoors. So we'll see. We'll see what we have some ideas. But, we'll be talking about that and developing plans in the coming weeks. So we are streaming live on Facebook and YouTube at the same time. So we're going to take questions, and if you have any questions you'd like to feed up to us, there's a basket up here, and I'll send it around again in a moment. It's got some paper in there you can write questions on. Anybody online can feed questions into, and we'll try to address those. So this is just meant to be a conversation, and I'm going to let Ken Egan kind of open us up, but I want to go ahead and introduce our guests tonight. Two esteemed gentlemen over here, ready to talk for, I don't know how long, an hour plus. They can talk a long time. Hopefully,
Just don't let us.
Hopefully we'll have a lot of good back and forth too, so be ready to engage here tonight. I'll start with Al Wiseman. Al is from Choteau, Montana, and has worked his whole life to preserve and share Montana's Métis history. He's a board member of the Old North Trail Museum in Choteau, and often speaks to school groups, leads hikes, and gives programs. He was a winner of the 2016 Heritage Keepers Award, which is given by the MHS Board of Trustees. Al is an enrolled member of the Little Shell Tribe, Chippewa Indians of Montana. And next to him is Nicholas Fruman. He lives in Helena. His work focuses on the reconfiguration period of Northern Plains indigenous history. He served as a state folklorist for both Montana and North Dakota, a lecturer in indigenous studies at the University of Montana, University of Ottawa, and University of Saskatchewan. So he's working north of the border and south of the border. That'll be a theme tonight, I think.
There's an exchange rate in there somewhere.
He was the director of Helena Indian Alliance and historian for the Native American Rights Fund. Currently, Nicholas serves as historian for the Little Shell Chippewa Tribe. He is a member of the board of directors of the Upper Missouri River National Heritage Area Planning Corporation and operates as a cultural conservationist under Northern Plains Folk Life Resources. And guiding us tonight will be Ken Egan, who we've introduced in the past for obvious reasons. And he is the executive director of Humanities Montana since 2009. And I'll just turn it over to you, Ken.
Thank you.
To lead us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. A big thank you to the Montana Historical Society. By the way, guys, let me know if I'm running a little hot on the mic. I'm an old teacher, so I tend to shout a little bit. So let me know if I'm too loud, actually. I do have to thank the staff of the Montana Historical Society. We're in a year-long experiment. What we're doing is we're carrying on a Facebook conversation about my book, Montana 1889, Indians, Cowboys, and Miners in the Year of Statehood. And so I'm going to share with you just a few very short stories from the book to kind of set the scene, if you will, or the context for what we're up to tonight. Before I do that, though, I want to reinforce something that Al shared a few moments ago, and I know some were still coming in. Please, please, please get to Choteau, June 14 through 16. June 14 through 16, get to Choteau for a remarkable festival of art and music and culture being hosted by the Métis Heritage Keepers, I believe, yes. And Al is important to that, and Jig Charette from Billings, a lot of people. It's an extraordinary event. I attended 2 years ago, and it was life-changing. It was beautiful, it was moving, and you can't beat Shoto in June, right? So I do urge you to get there. One other preliminary comment, I have a deep thanks to share with Nicholas Ruman. The section of my book dedicated to Louis Riel could not have been written without Nicholas's input, and I must say his critique, I heard him say earlier he wants someone who's objective and empathetic when they're reading his writing, and I think Nicholas modeled that. I think he was both kind and blunt, and it was really helpful for me, so I do want to thank him. Without further ado, just 4 quick stories, brief stories from Montana 1889. In many ways, this is for those who may be joining us streaming live through the Facebook group. But 4 stories. In February, I tell the story. Oh, I should explain. My book is broken up into months, so the chapters are in fact months. So in February, I tell the story of Louis Riel, an extraordinary man that ended up coming to Montana in 1879. Many folks don't know this. I think many Montanans assume Riel is Canadian. In fact, yes, has Canadian roots, but he spent a lot of his adulthood, key years here in Montana. And he led a resistance movement in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan. He tried to create what you might call a pan-Indian nation right in the heart of the continent. That was his great dream, right? Did not come to fruition. He's ultimately put to death by the Canadian authorities in 1885. Deeply moving. Following the resistance in Saskatchewan in 1885, many of his supporters, the Chippewa, the Cree, the Métis, come down into Montana, and in many ways, they become the landless people. They become, as it were, part of the Little Shell, and so we'll be hearing more about that tonight. We fast forward to March, and I told the story of James Fergus. James Fergus, you may know, Fergus County, named for him. He moved to Armel's Creek in the late 1870s, and that creek is named for, believe it or not, a Métis trader. And I hope you know that Lewistown and the whole Spring Creek area was in many ways settled by the Métis. We don't talk about it enough, I think, but the Métis are critical to the formation of Lewistown. And then we fast forward to June, and I tell the story of Granville Stuart, who's looking for a ranch in Montana. He wants to build a big old, good-paying ranch with the support of folks like Sam Hauser. He goes into the Judith Basin, and he witnesses in the June of 1889 the Métis hunting the last of the bison. It's a heartbreaking story because the bison, of course, are being decimated, and he witnesses that. And finally, in November, I'll tell the story of Frank Linderman, who had just moved to Flathead Lake in 1885. Remember, that's the year Louis Riel leads the resistance in Saskatchewan, and he's put to death. So Frank Linderman moves to Flathead Lake, and he meets many of the Cree who are fleeing down following the resistance in Saskatchewan, and it becomes a lifelong quest for Linderman to help the Cree and Chippewa establish a reservation, and he was part of, but I want to emphasize just a part of, the effort that created the Rocky Boy Reservation. So 4 stories that weave through Montana 1889. Now let's get to the heart of the story. Let's let the folks who know tell us their stories, and these guys are great storytellers. So the first question I'm going to ask, it's a big question, but I think the right question. Let's begin with Al. Who are the Métis?
The Métis is a mix with the French. The French came abroad into Canada for trapping, as we all know by studying history that everything at one period of time revolved around the fur trade. Today, that's not a very nice word, but that's the way it was then. That's fur trade was number one. And after they got into Canada, and I'll just say French, they intermarried with Scots and Irish and other cultures too, but they married into the Chippewa Cree women, and that created a whole new culture That's where the mixed blood comes in. And the Métis is a French word for mixed blood, people of mixed racial heritage. And it just goes on and on about this. I'll let Nicholas fill in a little bit more about this.
Sure. 1609, Champlain sends his folks out down the Ottawa River into the Great Lakes to see what's out west, meeting people all along the way. Really, from that time, the French dominated the northern part of North America really well until 1763 when they were ousted. So there was this whole settling of French, predominantly French Europeans, north, well, what's Quebec now. That really very quickly, by 1650, folks are at the lakehead of Lake Superior. And so we've got Europeans coming into our part of the world really early. But what really, the part that fascinates me, and I've only really come to this recently, is understanding that the majority of Métis in the Little Shell, the surnames in the Little Shell tribe, and this is Chippewa, Cree, Métis, and they're totally interrelated as one kind of polyethnic group of people, that most of the French names on the Little Shell rolls are the names of the soldiers with La Vérendrye who came in the 1740s. And it was the brothers who came out into Montana. And so some of my newest work is really looking at who those soldiers were, because they were part of, their orders were to go to various tribes, marry in, get to know them, and set up trade relationships. And so La Vérendrye's soldiers are still with us today in many of the Little Shell families, including yours, Elisa. Yeah. So it's been here for quite a while, and and we also know that the Chippewa Cree coming out of the Great Lakes, the Chippewa out of the Great Lakes, the Cree were right at that corner where the Great Lakes and the woodlands and the Great Plains come together, where Winnipeg, Pembina is now, and that's the beginning of the Great Plains. The Cree, Chippewa come out of the Great Lakes, they're with the Cree, they're related, they're cousins linguistically, they're mutually intelligible language. And the Cree and the Assiniboine already have a relationship, an alliance that goes back to, archaeologically, it's dated at 1570. We've got camps with mixed materials from both groups. So we know that the presumption is that there was a mass change after the collapse of Cahokia, and that part of that change was the Assiniboine, their Siouan group, leaving the Dakota Confederacy in the southern Great Lakes, and the Cree being north of the Great Lakes. The Assiniboine moved out of Minnesota and allied with the Cree. This is the 1575 archaeology. And so when the Chippewa came out, the Assiniboine and Cree were already here. They intermarried with them. Those Chippewa that came out of the Great Lakes, they had been intermarrying with the French around Sault Ste. Marie from the 1620s and 30s and 50s. So they were already, the Great Lakes already was a polyethnic indigenous society at that time, as the Western expansion was moving, and especially the big change came in after 1783, and when our American nation became codified, and all of a sudden a lot of people in the Great Lakes got scared because they knew the avarice of the new Americans, and they were all French and Catholic mixed heritage peoples. And they've got Anglo-Protestants coming at them, and they fought the revolution to get that land from the Appalachia to the Mississippi. And so there's, so they come out, as well as, Canada's still there with all their voyageurs coming out to this territory. The point being, we've got a mixed heritage society, a polyethnic mixed descent society right here on the line by 1730s. And 1740s and 1750s. So that's the Little Shell didn't come here after 1785, a group came down here, but they came to their relatives already here.
Very good. So if folks have questions, just shout out. 2 quick follow-ups to that. Thank you, Al and Nicholas. So we got a number of questions through the Facebook site. One of the questions is, aren't the Métis only Canadian? So I'll let Al answer that. And how are the Métis related to the Little Shell? There was some confusion about that. So if you could talk about that a little bit. So.
Well, with Little Shell and Métis, that's always been talked about quite a bit, but being I'm part of that group, when you were, your older people was connected with Chief Little Shell, you are a Little Shell, but you can have relatives, very close relatives, that wasn't connected with Chief Little Shell's tribe. And all Indian tribes have many chiefs. And they traveled in smaller bands, and so you can or you can't be a Little Shell. And Métis, of course, you're kind of on the side there too. So there again, this story, it just, it goes deep. There's so much to it to talk about. But Nicholas is, he knows deeply more about that than I do. I know the story, but he can explain it much better than I can, even though I'm one of.
So I have to hold up this book. If you don't know this is Nicholas's great book about the Little Shell, and you tell the story. The whole country was one robe, the Little Shell Tribes of America. So I hope everyone has had a chance to take a look at this, and so, yeah. So, thank you. Yeah. Questions? Any questions that occur to you? Any? Okay, very good. So another question that came over Facebook is, why did the Métis stay on the move so much? They seem to be on the move so much. Can you talk about that a little bit? So.
Me talk about it? Okay. The Métis, even before they come into Montana territory at that time, for sure, in Canada, they were really never liked. They were never wanted. And it was a really, really hard life for them to live that way. They were constantly looking over their shoulder about enemies and what have you. And of course, after Riel was hung in 1885, then our people dispersed. They went every which way. Some went farther north into Canada, and they went to all different provinces. They just fearing for their lives, they had to get out from where they were. And they went as far away as Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, of course, Montana. And it wasn't any better here for them either. When they came here, there again, they weren't accepted. They were, our people was considered as Canada people. So there again, our people wasn't liked. They couldn't get any kind of a jobs. Once in a while, they could pick up a rock picking job. That would be a top job. Very seldom they ever got any pay. It was they would give them a little bit of provisions for their families, if they had families. Most of them did. They worked very seasonal, and they worked whatever they could get. And the older children, they kind of took care of the younger ones. And the women, most of the women, not all of them, but most of them, they went right out in the field and worked right alongside the men. So whether it was fencing, rock picking, whatever it may be. And they handcrafted these, what they call stone boats, and you pull those with a team of horses, or most of the time 4 head of horses. And they were very low to the ground, maybe about a foot or so off the ground, because the only way they could get these stones on there was to lift them or roll them onto this stone boat. And it was really a hard life for them. I've always thought about this all my life, and my mother told me a lot of stories, and I've had a lot of good teachers in my life. My elders, of course, they're all gone now, and told me these stories about how they had to travel at night and different things like that. And it was just hard. And they didn't like to expose themselves any more than they had to, because people was looking at them, and I don't know, they were very resilient type of people, and strong-willed people. If they hadn't have been, none of us would have been here, I'll tell you that. And I don't know how they ever made it, but they did. And every community in Montana was, this is not really widely known, but any community that's any size at all, our people helped found a lot of these communities. And especially Lewistown. Lewistown was all Métis territory and country at one time. And the name they give Lewistown was Spring Creek, and that stuck to this day. But somehow or another it got changed from a prompt businessman to Lewistown. And it was no different from there, and they traveled back and forth from Turtle Mountain and various places, because people was related. They had cousins and uncles and aunts here and there, and they were always traveling on the move. And their transportation was Red River carts. That's how they traveled on.
Do those Red River carts squeak as much as I heard?
Yes, they do, and the reason for that is the first carts that was made was a solid wheel, and those was basically pulled by oxen. This goes way back, and then after horse come into existence, they started using horse, and you just one horse to a cart, and they started building the spoke wheel carts, and that was a very versatile little tool for them. The first carts they made, they only had 4 spokes, and they had trouble with the wheels collapsing because they hauled their buffalo out of the field, and they hauled their furs. There was no railroads or trucking or anything at the time. That was unheard of. There's regular cart trails from northern Canada into Minnesota. That's where the main fur depots was. And one man could handle easily 5 or 6 carts. And people say, how in the heck did they do that? Well, it's pretty easy. These oxen or horse, whatever, when you'd get these carts in a line, the back one would just follow the front cart. and it's the same as a dude string of dude ranches. This back horse, the man or woman or kid, whatever it may be, riding this back horse, they think they're guiding this horse. No, this horse is just following the one in front of it, and the one in front of him is following the next one. So that's kind of the way it is. But yeah, they on these wheels, they couldn't grease them. Well, they didn't have any grease anyway, but they couldn't grease them because it was a wood hub on wood axles, and it in no ways at all the wheels would lock up if you did have grease. But also, in a lot of my information that I have collected over the years, and I'm sure Nicholas has the same thing, is a lot of times the screeching was so bad with these carts going because these hubs on the axles of the cart, they would get polished just like glass. And when it becomes slick like that, they will really screech. But they would kill gophers and try to take some of the grease off of the gophers and rub on these axles. Well, that probably wouldn't last very far, and your squeaking would come back. So anyway, it's a long story.
The great innovation about the Red River carts, it was the first use of the wheel by indigenous peoples, or indeed any wheel in this part of the world.
Northwest.
Before Anglos had showed up with wheels. So, and it came out of Fort Pembina, right over at this line from the woodlands to the plains. And they experimented, as Al said, with the round and then the four-spoke. And then they realized that what they needed, the rolling, because of the bunch grass and the gopher holes and stuff, they needed a big wheel. And so they made a wheel like 6 foot tall and with a 9 to 12 spokes. And they dished the wheel, so the hub was here and the rim was out here, and that expanded the wheelbase also, so that it rolled across the prairies with no roads. But that allowed it to roll easily across the prairie. So that's the innovation, that's the invention of the Red River cart. That is the indigenous piece, the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous mind went into a pre-existing paternal side, European Celtic cart kind of a thing that came, through the fathers, the voyageurs, and then the folks in situ with their mothers' knowledge, skills, and abilities about the lay of the land and everything like that, as well as the technology that already existed from the travois, that's how they fabricated the Red River cart, which is like a travois lifted up with an axle under it with the wheels and then a platform on top. So it was, it's
With gopher grease, yeah.
Could I say a couple more things?
You betcha.
The reason for the wheels, I've been asked this many times on presentations. Al, how come they made the wheels so tall? Well, the reason for that is they arrived at 6 foot. The taller the wheels, the easier they roll, because you're pulling them with one animal, whether it's an ox or whether it's a horse. And the less friction you can have, the better off you are.
And I just got to add another thing. He mentioned ox. Where the heck did ox come from? So in 1815, I've been able to piece this together, that a group of Métis, which is the Indian way of saying Métis, same word, same meaning, same people. It's just whether you say it in French or whether you say it in Indian or Métis. They had this cart, and they knew that, and a horse does well, but an oxen's pull is a steady torque, and a horse's gait goes like this. And so they thought, well, we really need some ox. So a group went down from Pembina, and they went down to St. Louis. and then up on the other side in Prairie du Chien, and they bought a herd of cattle, and they herded it up to Red River, and they started breeding cattle. So there were herds of cattle and milk and cheese and oxen on the northern plains 50 years before the Texas herds got here with
Oh,
the
yes,
Anglo
oh,
cowboys.
yes, oh, yes, oh, yes.
But we don't hear about that. We
No.
hear about the myth of the Anglo cowboy and Lonesome Dove, Miles City, Railhead, the whole
Texas-
story.
Texas
But-
cattle drives.
I mean, if you just stop and think about it, Johnny Grant over here in Deer Lodge had a cattle ranch in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And so so cattle are already here, and they already knew how to work with cattle, so anyhow.
Very good, very good.
Yeah.
Questions, anybody? Yes.
Could you discuss a little bit about the Red River and that, when you say Canada?
Yeah.
But, early on, it was prairie. The buffalo didn't know the 49th parallel.
There were no nation states.
Yeah.
To say Canada, when we use terms like Canada and the United States, oh, they're Canadian or they're American. When you use that language with indigenous peoples, it's really a false argument, because this is pre-nation state time, and right, there is no 49th parallel, there is no medicine line, and what the people did, and to the mobility question. I liken it, I've come around to more of one of my mentors' understandings of history is through environmental history. How do humans fit into the environment as a way of trying to understand how we respond to life in front of us? And there are human there's elk bands of people, there are grizzly people out there, there are antelope bands, there's the antelope people. Well, we're the human people, and there are all these different bands followed the bison. The bison were the alpha breed or species on the plains, and everybody followed the bison. There was a northern herd and a southern herd. The Platte River, the north bank of the Platte River, is the southern extent of the northern herd. The other side of the south bank of the Platte is the southern herd all the way down to El Paso. And so our people, that is the range of our people, but it's not just the Michif. What the Michif did, the Michif, their maternal side is Cree, is Assiniboine, is Blackfoot, is Gros Ventre, is Crow, is Cheyenne. And so, in the French surnames or the Scots surnames among all these tribal peoples that we draw these distinctions between he's Blackfoot and he's Crow or whatever. The Michif were in between. They were the matrix in the mix of all of the native groups that were here at the time, and everybody followed the buffalo. And so, where the buffalo, when the snow went away and you went out on your spring hunt, you're out in May, and you go out and you just start going. And when you see the buffalo, that's where you are. When you've finished harvesting with that herd, you're out there until you have all that your wagons, all that your carts can carry, and then you come home. And then you go out and do that twice. Everybody, generally speaking, hunting happened on a family level constantly, but major harvesting expeditions by bands usually were twice a year, a spring hunt and a fall hunt.
Excellent. Other questions? Yes.
Tell us about how the Métis culture arose. It seemed to be different from any of the original cultures. How did the Métis wind up with such colorful clothes and customs and so on?
I think of there was never any stigma whatsoever among the Catholic peoples, whether French or Spanish, in being with the indigenous peoples of the lands that they came into. and cohabitation is as natural then as now, and that's what occurred. And children are born. Most of the, this is really fascinating. Most of the men stayed with their wives and raised their families. And a lot of men sent their children back east, either to Montreal or indeed to Edinburgh or Paris, and to be educated. So there's a sense of worldliness and global understanding that's there, and that comes into it. But I really think of the lodges where the people are, and 2, 3 children are born of the same parents, and they grow up on their rounds, moving about, and on their seasonal hunting trips. And in the evenings, the stories are told, and around the campfires. And the children they're hearing stories from their mothers. There is no European paternal context whatsoever. It's totally an indigenous context. Even though there are European genetics being born into the northern plains, they're being born into a 100% indigenous context. So they have their mother's brothers, their grandparents. They do not have their father's brothers and sisters. They do not have their father's parents. They don't have grandparents from European grandparents here at all. So they're really being raised as indigenous peoples, but they're hearing stories of Jesus. And they're hearing hymns. And they're hearing stories of knights on the round table. And they're hearing stories of Celts and French having war against England because of how terrible they are, and vice versa. And so there is this other piece that's coming into the customary example and the oral traditions that kids are growing up in. Now you got 2 generations of that, and all of a sudden these kids, the children of the mixed heritage families, even though all their cousins are, I'll say, I'm going to say it, but I don't want to say it, but I got to say it to say it. I don't want to use the word full blood. I don't like half blood and full blood and those kinds of things anymore. And that's why I use polyethnic and mixed heritage and mixed descent and stuff. But anyhow, by the time the second generation came around of hearing these stories, that the children in the camp started realizing that they started grouping together, that they had more in common themselves than they did among their cousins or their other set of cousins. And by 1830, there was an incredible population explosion on the northern plains of mixed descent peoples who were Catholic. And with this population explosion, all of a sudden, the carrying capacity of the land of band culture and harvesting, it became untenable for such a volume of people to behave in that kind of a cultural way. And so they started setting up towns. The city of Winnipeg is one of those towns. And numerous towns all along the borderline are started as Lewistown, as Choteau, started as these towns. And up on Milk River, there were whole towns the size of Choteau and Lewistown, all down the Milk River, and up on Frenchman's Creek. I mean, with blacksmith shops, with schools, with churches, with dry goods stores, I mean, towns. This was competition for the new Euro-American people coming into these communities. Our army burnt all those towns down along the border.
Yeah, many times.
Many times.
Many times.
Yes.
Right. So, and Al, could you talk a little bit about the sash you were wearing?
Yeah.
Was that a gift? I think you received the sash.
Yes, it was a gift from some of my Canadian friends that I've worked with, and Nicholas has worked with these people. This sash is it's quite a interesting item. This here came from the Gabriel de Mont's Institute, this insignia here. And this is our infinity flag, the blue flag, the Métis flag. And these sashes is, this is a men's sash here, and it's quite long. Some is longer. They're used for many different things. The older people, when they had, before they had bridles, you could knot them up like this and put them in a horse's mouth. They called that a war bridle, and use this for a war bridle. If they didn't have a piece of rawhide or whatever with them, they had their sash. If you could catch a horse or whatever, and you had a bridle right here. They were used for washcloth, drying cloth. You could put them around the women. Used to be mostly the wood gatherers, and you tie them like this and put your little wood in here and tuck it up, and you had your hands free, and away you'd go, and your wood could be sticking out however. Every one of these colors of this yarn has, it represents something. I'll tell you about it. These tassels on here tell you about that too. This, the red yarn here, that represents our Indian heritage and the blood of our ancestors, the red yarn. The green yarn here that you see, what do we have in springtime? It's starting out there right now a little bit, green grass, green leaves. That represents that. These, the yellow yarn here, that represents the sun. The blue yarn there, that represents the sky. And the white, that represents our clouds. And this one doesn't have it, but some of the sashes do, is they'll have black thread or yarn weaved in this sash. There's many different colors. Some of them is whiter than this. But if you have black yarn mixed in here, that represents hard times, death in the family, and such as that. That's what that represents. These little tassels on here, this yarn, there's a bunch of individuals. They're the same color it's in here, and they just go out. You can take and cut these off one at a time or two at a time or whatever you want to do with them. And you got emergency sewing kit. They used, they either have bone needles, or they would fix a wooden needle. And I'm very fortunate in my life. I have my grandfather's wooden needle that he sewed with. I have that in my possession. So that's kind of neat, but there's just a lot to it. A lot of the older people, when I was a kid, a year or two ago, they, if they were left-handed, they would tie them over here, and if you're right-handed, all you do is spin them around and hang them off of here. These was also used for not only identification purposes, but they were used as part of your dress. Like in today's society, it has been for many, many years. Our people never done it that much, but when you go to certain functions, you might have to wear a tux. There's some places you can't get in someplace unless you're suited up or duded up, as they call it, whatever you want to call it. But they would use these sashes for, like I say, for identification, and was part of their dress. And it's just quite a story behind these, and but that's a little bit about it. There's other things, like I say, most anything that Nicholas and I talk about. Sometimes you don't know where to start, and you don't know where to stop. There's so much to it.
Storytelling is a skill.
Yeah, it's kind of like our infinity flag here. We go.
Kinda.
Does that kind of clear things?
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? Yes.
So where is the sash made? Is that something that the indigenous folks were making, or were they trading for them?
Oh yes, they. Yeah, these was traded. They had trading purposes with them. Yeah, and I forgot to mention too, the women's sash is a little bit narrower than this sash, and most of the women, not all of them, but most of them, they'll tie them and carry them this way in front. Not all, they can go on the waist too, but most of the time. And then they have little kid sash that just maybe that wide. And they had they were various ways. And
There's always something you need a sash for.
Useful.
another thing with this sash, most everybody in Montana and probably abroad too is very familiar with Charlie Russell. Well, when you look at Charlie Russell's paintings, there is hardly a painting that he done that he hasn't got a sash on his hip. Yeah, he's had just about any painting. And the reason for that is when he came from back east and landed in the Judith Gap country, that's where a good lot of our people was. Actually, they were all over Montana, but there was a lot of them in the Judith Gap country. And he lived with our people, and they taught him many things. I'll share one thing with you that you will not read in your history books. There's a lot of things about our culture that's not in our history books. Never was, probably never will be. But we that know a little bit about the story, we know this. Charlie Russell come here, and his goal was he wanted to become a cowboy. He wanted to learn to rope and to ride. Well, guess what? The Métis people is the one that taught him to rope and to ride. You will never find that in your history books, but this is true material.
In the Judith country, the bison went away 1882-83 was the last of it. And then the next year, the herds from Fort Shaw, the herds from the Deer Lodge Valley were being driven up into the Judith country. And the stockmen were prepared to immediately move right in on the vacating of the bison from really the finest pasture in the world for herd animals. And who were the people who were already there, who had already had 50 years of experience working with cattle? Well, that's the Mitchifs, the Spring Creek Band. And so they became some of the first hands on some of those first ranches, the N-Bar, the DHS, all of those, a good high percentage of those first hands were the Mitchifs that the year before were part of that last hunt that was being witnessed by Granville Stuart.
Yeah, that tells it pretty well, that Granville book story. Yeah.
And Granville Stuart has his own connection with Métis.
Yeah.
He came up from the south after the Civil War with his brother, and he came up through, coming up through Monida and that area. and he came up through the Beaverhead into the Deer Lodge Valley and ended up at Johnny Grant's Mitchell colony there in Deer Lodge. And that's where he and his brother settled in and became part of that kind of polyethnic, global, multilingual society that was happening at Hellgate and in Deer Lodge. Those were these two major places of this kind of really wild hybrid society. But that's the Mitchell Society, and it was the Mitchell that were already here who, that various European peoples came in, and the Stuarts, they married in down in Deer Lodge. They had Indian families, and Granville actually, though, left his Indian family and ended up marrying, once he moved up into the Judith country with a DHS and got super rich and became a father of Montana, he had an Anglo family and basically forgot about his native family.
Yeah, pretty common story.
Yeah.
Questions, more questions, these are great. Yes?
The first Métis uprising, they said they didn't have any trouble organizing because they'd already had kind of like a system set up, so because of the buffalo hunts. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how they didn't have to, figure out how to have the order that they needed?
That's a great question, because what it sparks in me is the distinction between the Métis of the Northern Plains and all other mixed heritage peoples that came out of the colonial era, both in the United States and North America and globally. The distinction between what happened here and, say, all of the mixed heritage peoples in the Southeast, where there was major mixing, and is that the people here came to actual political nationhood. That they had an economic system, they had an education system, they had a military defensive system, and so these are the hallmarks of sovereignty, which then in that era, it was the era of new nation states. I mean, Canada and the United States were, not even 100 years, well, they were just brand new actually. And Métis were already here and already organized. And it wasn't just the Métis, I mean, all of the tribal peoples the buffalo bands who followed the northern herd, there was a governing structure that was both social and political and defensive. So it was already a complex society. And so when there was problems with having to express that sovereignty, they were prepared to do it. And they really had probably the strongest military presence on the Northern Plains by the 1850s.
Kim, yeah, we had a question from YouTube, and they're asking, where could you see a Red River cart? And one with huge wheels, preferably. Where could you find one?
Lewistown.
Yeah.
Fort
Lewis,
Fort Benton.
go ahead.
You'll find one at the Historical Society at Lewistown.
Central
And-
Montana Museum.
Yes, and you'll find another one at Fort Benton. They have one there. And there's numerous carts around Montana, various places. I have one in Choteau, Montana, but mine is not really a true Red River cart. And no cart that you will find anywhere after the regular Red River carts with the rawhide wrapping on the wheels and such as that, anything that built after that, they're replicas of, they're not a true Red River cart. Like I say, I have one at the museum in Choteau, but it's not a true Red River cart, it's a replica one.
Red River carts were ubiquitous on the northern plains. I estimate that there were between 50 to 75,000 of them. I only know of 3 original ones that
Yeah,
have survived.
there's-
They're 100% wood, not a piece of metal on them. When they became obsolete, they were broken up for firewood or they just rotted. And we have no, 50,000 Red River carts. Their buffalo hunts, there are primary source accounts of 3,500 carts screeching across the prairie. And each one of them could carry 900 pounds of buffalo meat. So these folks are coming back, and they became the richest people around. They're making hundreds of thousands of $1840, hundreds of thousands. And all of a sudden, very quickly, it was understood, ooh, there's competition out there to the whites coming west.
Yes, question in the back. Oh, up here, sorry.
I have a question about language. Have your own language, and how did you communicate with other tribes?
The lingua franca of the northern plains was Cree. Cree. Blackfeet spoke Cree, Crow spoke Cree, Cheyenne spoke Cree. Cheyenne are Cree. Cheyenne means Shahia, means little Cree in Cree. They split off earlier. They were in North Dakota, up in that area. Anyhow, so you're laughing. I can go off on tangents. What was the question?
So the language.
Okay. See, Al used to take it. Michif is their language, and Michif was thought to be a trade language, was thought to be a pidgin language, was thought to be a patois, but it was only brought forward as and understood as a true language in 1973 by a linguist over at the University of North Dakota who went over to the Turtle Mountains and listened to how people were talking over there. People at Turtle Mountain are the same as at Rocky Boy, same as Little Shell. All are exactly the same people. They're the same people in the Capel Valley. They're the same people all along southern Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta. All the Chippewa Cree Métis people are the same. So the language it was pervasive. This language is the things of life. The nouns are French. The way of things are Cree and Chippewa, mostly Cree. So feminine, active is indigenous. The solid, tangible nouns and such are French. And it actually is a growing, living language. There's about 1,000 speakers left today. And most of them are on the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. Yep.
Thank you. I saw another hand, yes.
I just had a question relative to how the Métis related to the voyageurs of the Canadian canoe brigades that were going up into northern Canada. I kind of envision them as probably being descendants of those.
They are them.
But, okay.
That's exactly right. They're called voyageurs when they leave Montreal, and then they would go back, and they go back and forth. But there were those men who were called the winterers, and they wintered over. And those are the men who had families out here. The voyageurs would go back and forth, but all of the men who ended up staying out here began as voyageurs. Yeah.
Could I say one thing about that language? A lot of our real older people, they had no education at all, most of them, but they could speak as high as 6 languages. And today, you ask people, how many language can you speak? And we're supposed to be educated, but there's very, very few people could speak 6 languages, and even though you're educated. That's kind of a, that's kind of something right there. Well, not having an education.
About Michif again, Michif was the language that was spoken inside the society. And in that, so it was for themselves that this language was developed. When they were speaking to outside themselves, they had any language they needed. They had French, they had Gaelic, they had Cree, they had Assiniboine, and so Michif was their language, and so it's part of their identity.
And that language is still alive.
It is.
And are there any efforts being made to make sure that that language
There are.
doesn't
It is
extinct?
included in the effort that's going on now in a very significant way, both federally and state level, to protect and do what we can to keep living these languages. Yeah.
I've always wondered about pronunciations of like Chippewa, Chippeway, Ojibwa, Ojibwe. I'm not sure how we're supposed to pronounce that.
Well, get out the rule book. Did you bring the rule book?
Yeah, I didn't. I left it at home.
It's Dan is Dan Pocha, and that family name is spelled many, many ways.
Mhm.
It's pronounced, it's a phonetic. It's pronounced, but when the scribes at a treaty or at a payout or at a fort logging book, whoever that scribe is wrote down phonetically, however well he knew English himself, wrote it down like that. And so Ojibwe, Ojibwe, and not only that, but then there's the dialects of it. Are you Eastern Door, are you Western Door? And are you're North or you're South? And so all of those, there's no wrong way really. It's what is your way. And there are ways that are attached, traditional ways of speaking, that come from certain communities. Like over on the Turtle Mountains, when we were with the Little Shell doing language preservation work through state monies here, we went over to Turtle Mountain to talk with those folks about it, and they were saying, well, we've got 5 dialects of Michif just on this reservation. And it's an 8x12 reservation. So,
Very good. So, Al, could you talk a little bit about the importance of music in Métis culture?
Okay. I've been told this by a lot of my elders. I had elders in my generation that played fiddle, and they did not call them violins or anything like that. Violin is a totally different type of music. But there was 2 things for sure that kept our people together that was always most important to me, from what I was told and grew up with it, is they had great faith in the Lord. That I'll put that number 1. The tiniest little cabins, people with nothing, but they always had a Bible in their presence, always. They were basically of Catholic faith, and they just had a great faith in the Lord. Number 2 was that fiddle. That fiddle was very, very important to our people. It kept our people together. They were basically introduced to the fiddle by the French. But there was other cultures, the Scottish and Irish and them, they had fiddle too. But our people never seen a fiddle. They didn't know what that thing was until the French, Scottish, and Irish came into northern Canada on their fur trades. And once our people got a hold of that fiddle, they took it and they run with it. And it's probably one of the most hardest instruments that there is to learn to play. I tried it a little bit in my life, and I never stuck with it long enough to learn it, but I knew right off the bat that it's not a very friendly instrument. Not friendly at all. But yet, my grandfather, my wife had a great uncle. They never had, my grandfather had a third grade education. Well, that don't put you very far up the ladder as far as education goes. And my wife's great uncle, I don't think he had much education at all. But those two guys, and there was many others too, but I'll just speak of those two, they could sit down in the early evening and play that fiddle all night long until the sun come up and never play the same tune twice.
That's right.
Never play the same tune twice. And it's always been said, I heard that when I was just a little shaver, the Métis people was born to dance. That's one of the sayings. And my wife and I, we both grew up around fiddle music. Her daddy played fiddle. A lot of her relatives did. And I always knew there was other type of music, but we didn't pay attention to it because about every Saturday night there was a fiddle dance someplace. And they would dance in the smallest little cabins. They didn't have dance halls. Maybe a country school someplace, and they weren't too big either. But people never had much furniture, but they'd move it out, whatever it was, and everything but the cook stove, I guess, and they would have a dance. And the thing of it is, it always amazed me is back when I was growing up, there's no such a thing as babysitters. If you had one kid or 10 or whatever, you went with your folks. You went. And heck, you were under beds and to sleeping and wherever you could lay down. And people had, they had great times. They would play till just before midnight. They would play the supper waltz. And they would take a break for a little bit and they would eat. Always had something. As far as the people was very, very poor people, but they didn't have food like we have. We go to functions now, to potlucks, and you'll find everything there. But our people was basically sandwiches. That's basically what it was. It might have been a ground deer meat, elk meat, sheep, wild sheep that is, and such as that. It was a lot of sandwiches, but there was always plenty of food, and to feed all these people as poor as he was, I don't know how they done it, but they did. It was just it was fun times growing up. I'm glad that I was in that generation of people that grew up like that, and those fiddle players, I tell you, a lot of them, they were something. But up in our little settlement west of Shoto, there was about 125 people up there, and that was kids and all. And my grandmother told me, and others did too, that almost every man could play the fiddle somewhat. And it's no different today with any instrument that you play. Some people play it, and some people play at it. It's kind of the same thing. But they didn't have any, television, or never had electricity or anything like that, and they created their own good times. Horse racing in the summertime, they had that, and just a lot of things, a lot of fun times they had.
Very good. Before I ask the last question, someone in the audience asked how these wonderful gentlemen could, say, present at schools. And it just so happens, I'm Executive Director of Humanities Montana, and we provide programs and grants all over the state of Montana. And Nicholas is on our Speakers Bureau and is happy to travel. And if you would like to invite Al as well to go to your school, we provide funding for that as well. So if you'd like to hear more about Humanities Montana, happy to tell you about that. But they're wonderful, and I hope they are itinerant. They go all over the state. The last question, this came from Facebook. And the question is about the status of the Little Shell people. And the Facebook questioner said that he's heard that there's been movement toward federal recognition of the Little Shell people. Is that true? And if that happens, what difference will that make for the Métis if the Little Shell are recognized? So I don't know if you want to
Have
speak
at
to
it, you're the man.
The Little Shell, to answer an earlier question that'll get me to answering this one, the range of identities between those who see themselves as traditionalists and sun dancers and sweat lodge and pipe people, to those who are Catholic and live a more Euro-style life, that range of identities exists within the Little Shell. And so there are those who consider themselves Indians and those who consider themselves Michif. Genetically, they're the same people and have come through the same experiences. It's how they self-identify. And really the distinction is whether you are Catholic or not. Now, there is also, earlier on, it doesn't make a difference now, but it did when life was still tribal and that community life, tribal life was communitarian, and before the market economy had, and the superstructure had overlaid itself. It used, Métis early on were private property people, whereas their cousins were not. And though Catholicism and belief in private property from their paternal heritage was the major, genetically, they're all the same people. It's how you self-identify culturally. And those are the two main distinctions, private property and Catholicism, or Christianity, I'll say. So, the question?
Is there movement on federal recognition of the Little Shell people?
We are almost back where we were just before Christmas. And it has been through the House. Representative Gianforte has done an incredible job in bringing it forward a second time and getting it all the way through. It passed unanimously through the House. It is out of committee in the Senate, out of Indian Affairs Committee. Now it's waiting for a vote in front of the full Senate. And it's when our representatives and senators can make that happen. Basically, it's up to Senator Daines at this point. Senator Tester has been there a long time and always doing yeoman's work. And it's Senator Daines, because his party is in control, it's up to him to make this happen in the Senate. And we're feeling cautiously hopeful. And everybody, I think, actually even nationally, people are beginning to understand there's a unique American story here in Montana. It's connected to North Dakota and the Prairie provinces, but it really all culminated right here in Montana because Louis Riel, in fact, was an American citizen. He became a U.S. citizen here in Helena, and he always intended to return, and his family wanted to return. He loved school teaching, and that life. And so, you know, his relatives are still here. I mean, here's a guy who is a father of Canadian Confederation, and, you know, we don't even know about him, you know? Anyhow, but,
Yes, last word, Al.
Could I say one thing about this, the Little Shell people and this federal recognition? My wife, which is, her maiden name is Gray, and one of her relatives was, this is back in the early 40s, he was the first Métis lawyer in the state of Montana.
indigenous lawyer, first
Yes,
indigenous
first
lawyer.
indigenous lawyer in the state of Montana. And he really got some breaks from his, he called them his brothers, his, the white lawyers that he worked with. They took him in. I guess he made an impression on him, and he wanted to become a lawyer, so his white brothers took and loaned him their law books. And he studied law at night, and he worked at the East Smelter here during the day. And unfortunately, he died off at a young age, and he didn't get things completed, but for this federal recognition, but he was one of them that worked very, very hard on this, and I'm sure that he hoped to see it go through. Well, he didn't. And now the chairman of the Little Shell tribe is Gerald Gray Jr. out of Billings, and he's also a relative of my wife. And we've talked about this, Nicholas and I and my wife. If this federal recognition could go through, which I'm hoping it will, it would sure be something for the Gray name to see it completed.
Yep.
That would be a proud, proud day for them.
That's beautiful, beautiful.
Do you know the number of that bill so we can all contact Senator Dane?
I don't have it memorized, I'm sorry. Yeah. The Little Shell, well, you know, that brings up a point. We talk about recognition, and really what we're after is the federal government, the Little Shell are already recognized. They're already part of a treaty, but then they were culled out of people, out of the group out of North Dakota. And so it's called a, not a recognition, what is the name of the bill? Restoration, Little Shell Restoration. And that, and we gave up, we'd always been going for federal recognition. And then I said, well, you know, really, the tribe's already been recognized. It's that we have to bring the federal government back to understanding actions of theirs, decisions of theirs, separated the Little Shell from their core group. And so it's restoring their rights, so that's what it's called. Yeah.
Can you talk about how it went off the tracks, why it has to be restored?
In 1892, over in North Dakota, is what's called what occurred was famously called the 10-cent treaty. And that came from the Macomber Commission that was appointed by the U.S. Congress to come in, and they all of a sudden, in 1892, the federal government realized that they've got North Dakota being settled by all these farmers, and they don't have title to the land. And the ancestral peoples of the Little Shell, Rocky Boy, and Turtle Mountain people, it was their unceded land. It was the northern third of North Dakota, all the way across from the top of the state. That was the unceded land. And so they sent this commission to get that land, And Chief Littleshell said, we have so many people. We have 3,500 people in our tribe. Most of them are in Montana because that's where the last of the buffalo were. And so they're still there because there's no food back here, but we need a reservation of a certain size so that all of our people can come back home. And the government said, no, we're going to give you a reservation this size. Littleshell said 30 by 30, and the government gave them 8 by 12. And then it went to court, and it took 15 years for it to go through court and then finally be authorized. And that happened in 1905. And at that point, well, first, Chief Littleshell wouldn't sign the papers in 1892 for this reservation. He's saying, I'm not going to sign that. It isn't going to work. So the government said, okay, you're out of here. And they appointed their own kangaroo council, as it were, and passed the agreement. It wasn't a treaty. And so all those people who were followers of Chief Littleshell, which was the whole traditional government that had been there from time immemorial, a legitimate sovereign government, the United States government just lopped it off, put their own government in place. They signed the treaty. And so all of Chief Littleshell's people, who are these people here, were left off the rolls and have been left off the rolls since. That was 126 years ago. And they've been out here, and then they were on the edges of white communities, no buffalo or anything, nothing to eat, so they ate at the dumps. And then that was outrageous to the new white community. So they created the Rocky Boy Reservation to handle all such homeless Indians in Montana. But the government seriously underestimated how many landless Indians there were. And they came in and realized there's 2,500 people here, and they've only got the money and land to handle 450. So in 1917, they brought in an Indian agent who called the rolls. And those on Rocky Boy were those of Rocky Boy and Little Bear's direct bands. There were numerous bands. There are at least 8 bands, if not 12 bands in Montana. So all those left cut off the rolls in Rocky Boy, that's who Littleshell are today. It comes from that 1917, and they've been petitioning ever since to have their rights recognized.
Well, let's have a huge round of applause for Nicholas and Al. There is a lot of food left. You can visit. Thank you so much for being here. It was an extraordinary night.
I got to get a taste of that.
My great-grandmother was a gray.
Was it gray?
Yeah.
Well,
Now their gerbil senior will actually realize
I'm
We're related.
that's what it's for.